Good evening, Team Krulak community. Welcome back to another episode of our mini-series on conflict in Ukraine. We're down the rabbit hole on the Russia-Ukraine war with Dr. Yuval Weber, our Russia SME here at Marine Corps University in the Krulak Center. So today we're going to focus on there's a big event today over in Brussels, a NATO conference, which had really a number of pretty big outcomes, which are too far to list here. There was discussion of additional refugees coming to the United States. President Zelensky, whose country is not a NATO member, and that's been very specifically noted by many people, including himself. But he addressed the NATO Assembly, asking for additional aid. There were new sanctions. Lots of stuff came out of this conference. But what we focus on for this episode are some new force posture items that did come out. There were new new troop deployments that were discussed on the NATO countries bordering Ukraine. There's an activation of a special CBRN force that has been in existence for close to 20 years, but has not yet been activated until today, as well as some words on American President Joe Biden on what a response might be should Russia decide to use those types of weapons. So we're going to try and get through what we can here in a short amount of time. So Dr. Weber, good evening, and turn it over to you.
Major Brown, pleasure as always. Yes, big news from NATO today. Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg will extend his term in office by 1 year. Okay, that was not the big news of today. But it did indicate that obviously in a crisis, NATO did not want to change its direction, change horses midstream, as it were. But yeah, as you mentioned today, one of the things that obviously had been motivating, at least rhetorically, President Putin's opposition to Ukraine and its actions has been the expansion of NATO. And in Putin's rhetoric over the last number of years, and he had said that the expansion of NATO was the thing that actually concerned Russian security the very most. Political scientist John Mearsheimer had said, famously enough, that NATO expansion is the taproot of Russia's insecurity. We've also seen in Russia's actions that it may not be NATO that offends Russia as much, but it could be the very existence of a Ukraine that does not wish to be an imperial subject of Russia, and everything that comes from there. But nevertheless, if Putin had been afraid of NATO expansion or NATO bulking up its defenses on his doorstep, as it turns out, invading a country that is very close to NATO will produce that very response. Because the big thing that NATO did announce today is that it is going to stand up 4 new battle groups. And a battle group, I just looked up, but I could be wrong on this, is usually 1,000 to 1,500 soldiers. There are existing ones right now in Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. So basically, the northwest corner of Europe, when looking at Russia, so to speak. But the 4 new ones today are going to go to Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. So this will provide the line of defense towards southeastern Europe. This will provide greater ability of NATO to project power into the Black Sea. And not to put too fine a point on it, but this basically encircles Ukraine. And so it provides for the defense of the rest of Europe and provides for more burden sharing amongst NATO members onto the defense of Central, Eastern, and Southeastern Europe. So this is, as President Biden has said a number of times, that the United States and he personally is going to defend every inch of NATO territory. This is it. This is what the countries in the region have been asking for. And the crisis now has made that at least a semi-permanent feature of European security. The result will be we'll see some mini version of the Cold War. Russia doesn't have the attractive ideology that it used to. But when we think about battle groups standing on either side of very clear lines, that's clearly coming back.
Yeah. So, turns out careful what you wish for, because he just made his worst nightmare come true. One of the many assumptions where he seems to have been in error.
So
another thing.
And even on that note, So he had had the Belarusians change their constitution in order to remove their non-nuclear status. So one, that would obviously be to have Russian nuclear weapons on the territory of Belarus, and then have Russian troops on the border with NATO. So if being close to NATO is the thing that made him nervous, he just did the thing that made him nervous to create, in effect, the crisis that he now has to deal with.
Yeah, yeah, not laws of unintended consequences have been at play in pretty much from day one here, really before day one. But another thing were just talking about now that had come out of it was the activation of the CBRN. I don't recall the nomenclature. You said if it was a task force or a group or a response team, but you noted that it was first created in 2003 and activated for the first time today, which seems definitely a pretty significant development. Not that there have been chemical, nuclear, biological weapons in the world since 2003, and this hasn't been called for until now. So, what are the implications of that? Do you think, is this a messaging aspect, or is this just getting ready for the absolute worst case scenario?
So getting ready and messaging, those are just different time points on the same action. So to the extent that we've seen, President Biden and basically this intelligence and military apparatus around him being very aggressive in declassifying information in order to let the world know what the Russians are about to do. We saw that ahead of the war itself, they'd been able to, let's say, predict or to reveal ahead of the actual false flag attempts what the Russians were going to do several times in a row till it got to the point that the Russians had ran out of false flag attempts or false flag stories to just go ahead and do the war they were going to do from the get-go. So which also showed that the Russians were not serious about any sort of substantive diplomacy except for NATO capitulation and Ukrainian pre-surrender to a war. So to the extent that the task force that you just mentioned, the CBRN, for those who are not familiar, that stands for chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear. So that's all the unconventional threats. Cyber can be put into this, but all the stuff that really offends, the human spirit as well as the body. That's the stuff that we're talking about. And so this task force, which has 3,000 experts, it has obviously the special equipment. And what those experts do is obviously they get deployed in a crisis, but they also train the various units responsible for CBRN response in all the NATO militaries. So that's basically like the nerve center of this sort of response. First time in almost 20 years that it's been activated, which means that in effect, President Biden and his allies have seen sufficient intelligence that makes them think that Russia's getting closer to whatever line that President Putin has, where he feels he's losing this war, and that he's going to resort to unconventional, not just things that are against like Geneva Conventions or things that offend common morality, such as just sheer destruction of cities, but to the stuff where if he doesn't think he's getting what he needs in order to win this war in a conventional sense, or to win this war against the armies of Ukraine, that he has these other things that he can get to. And so what President Biden said today was, in response to the question of what are you going to do if President Putin does use chemical weapons, because you've been talking about this. Biden had previously said he's seen evolving intelligence on this. He said, and I now quote, "We will respond if he uses it. The nature of the response would depend on the nature of the use." So again, strategic ambiguity. That's sort of good to not commit oneself to any particular path. But what it suggests is that this is more likely than not going to happen, and that they want the world to know that this is the Russians doing it and not some sort of, how to put it, the Ukrainians doing it against themselves in order to blacken the image of Russia abroad. When chemical weapons were used in Syria, that was one of the lines that was used against the rebels, that they basically gassed themselves in order to embarrass Bashar al-Assad. So we'll see. We don't know what would be a U.S. global or NATO response to this. We don't know if this would lead to just NATO entering the war. We don't know if this would be establishment of a no-fly zone, which seems to be an idea that has been rejected continuously by President Biden. But public pressure could change the calculations of what that would mean, even though that would mean knocking Russian airplanes out of the sky and knocking Russian ground air defense, into the next world. We simply don't know, but we can assume that if the Russians are threatening the use of nuclear weapons and President Biden is talking about the use of chemical weapons, that we're about to go into a much more violent phase of the conflict.
Yeah, I guess it's something that it's been talked more and more about, because they haven't had the success on the ground conventionally. It gets a lot worse before it gets better. Before they're not just going to pack up what's left of their tanks and their soldiers and go home. They're going to leave a lot worse behind them. Also, the response, or what our response might be. I think we were talking about this before too. It's strategic ambiguity in a way that, looking back at Syria and the use of chemical weapons there was less ambiguity initially, right? Chemical weapons, red line, we're not going to cross it, and then the line was crossed, and Putin didn't really suffer any significant consequences. So I guess, do you think now maybe the fact that we're not saying red line, but that there's going to be a response tailored to what they do? Do you think that maybe puts some pause to Putin's decision?
Yeah, so certainly, we can see that this is not the first time that Russia's gone into a neighboring country. Even before Putin's time, Transnistria is sort of a frozen conflict, breakaway republic from Moldova. But even during Putin's time, there was a war in Chechnya, which was in Russia's own territory, but conflicts with Georgia, annexation of Crimea, intervention into Syria. And so in each one of these things, Russia's gone in, seeing if there's going to be any consequences, finding that there hasn't been any consequences. And so each of these in totality, when you think about from Chechnya to Georgia to Crimea to Syria, these have gone up and up in terms of the size and complexity of these. And it's clear that President Putin thought that this was going to be very quick. In all the prisoner of war videos that I've seen, they've all basically been described. All the soldiers who have been captured have said some version of, "We were told this is going to take 2 days. They welcome us as liberators." We have all the descriptions of the people around Putin who said that this was going to be a 2-week special military operation. So they didn't anticipate any pushback. The pushback that they've received is, one, for the last couple of months, even ahead of the conflict, NATO has been sending a lot of military equipment to the Ukrainians. After the war started, the most intense sanctions regime on any major state in human history. We have Finland on the path to NATO membership. The Swedes are making sure that Finns go first. We have the Ukraine is on the fast track to EU membership. Germany, 100 billion euro military modernization fund has been established. 2% goal of defense spending of GDP is going to go into their constitution. They've opened up the opportunity and sort of the opportunity for themselves to redefine the European project as containing Russia instead of constraining their own nationalism. They're going to put the Bundeswehr in Eastern Europe for the first time since, as people may recall, the 1940s. We're in a totally different universe of what is the security response to Russia. And this is all before we have a norm, internationally speaking, that the use of chemical weapons against civilians, against military forces is wrong. It's backed up by the Geneva Conventions. And the reason that I personally think that Biden did not want to commit to anything too much is like we talk a lot about off ramps in terms of not trying to raise the temperature, offering a way out, basically activating a task force, but not committing to any sort of action against it, is in fact the off ramp for Putin to reconsider where this would go. Because if this were to be used, these chemical weapons were to be used, the amount of pressure on Biden, Scholz, Macron, Johnson, everyone to do something really, really harmful to Russian forces in the field would be insane. We can take from what happened in Syria is that not many people in Europe, the United States, want to intervene in a third major land war in the Middle East in a generation, but there was still international outcry. The West is already semi-committed, short of actually doing any shooting, to this war in Ukraine. This could be the sort of thing that would propel public pressure on these leaders to do something more. And that would be very bad for Putin and his ability to prosecute this conflict.
Yeah, although again, as we're talking about before we started recording, the public pressure, there's still a tension there because tension, as we were saying, the polling, at least on the American side, is the president should do more, but we also don't want to commit ground troops. It's that's a tension that can't last forever, and be I hope we don't have to find out whether an unconventional weapon attack tilts the balance one way or the other. Because we'd be off into really horrible uncharted territory at that point. Well, on that happy note, I think we'll call it an evening. Dr. Weber, again, as always, thank you very much for your time. I know we've been getting great feedback from our community of interest on these short episodes. So they are getting listened to and appreciated, and they are definitely helping our audience figure it out. So we're very grateful for you to do that. And I also want to make sure I do note you slipping in a wag the dog reference about changing the horses in midstream. So I wanted to make sure that didn't go unanswered or unnoted. So
yeah,
different conflict, different use of information and things back then. But anyway,
every episode I'm going to fit in at least one reference to 80s or 90s pop culture to really appeal to the elder millennials in the audience.
Yeah, no, it's definitely become a staple, and I'm counting on it now from here on out.
Okay.
All right. Again, thank you very much, Dr. Weber. Have a good evening.
You too. Take care, Major Brown. Bye-bye.